Williamsburg County Rosenwald schools. Well, back in 2002, and some of this information is on your program, the National Trust for Historic Preservation created a listing of America's 11 most endangered historical places, and Rosenwalds were on the list. There are Rosenwald schools in 15 states, and efforts have been underway in these 15 states to ensure that this rich history is preserved, and those that still have buildings standing, that those are preserved. Unfortunately, here in Williamsburg County, we have no buildings still standing. In fact, we're trying to find the location of some of the buildings and would like for you to assist us in establishing exactly where those schools were located previously.
Rosenwald schools started when Booker T. Washington met with Rosenwald and decided that we needed to educate black citizens or children of black citizens in the South. They started doing schools in Alabama, just out of Tuskegee, and they went around Alabama, and I think there are 13 other states that have Rosenwald schools. In South Carolina, there are quite a few. In Williamsburg County, there were 10 Rosenwald schools. These schools were started so that children could become educated and be able to make a living for themselves. In the schools, they had all kinds of activities. They were taught how to read, how to do math, how to sew, how to tan, how to do a number of activities that would provide them with skills so that they could make a living.
In about 1912, Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, who was then the president and CEO of Sears and Roebuck and Company, had a conversation, and it came about as a result of Rosenwald inviting Booker T. to Chicago to speak to his board. And it was there that Booker T. approached Rosenwald and asked him to serve as a board member of Tuskegee, at that time, Institute. Now it's Tuskegee University. Julius Rosenwald was a bit hesitant. He was a Jewish immigrant. He was a bit hesitant, so he decided he'd make a trip to Tuskegee. And upon the visit there, he realized all of the very significant and important things they were doing, and he readily agreed to serve on their board. So in fact, he served until his death in the 1930s, long after Booker T had passed. Because in 1912, when they first started collaborating, the emphasis was to help to educate the black children in the South. And they started with the Rosenwald schools in Alabama, and of course ventured into 15 states and also into South Carolina.
Rosenwald was the chairperson of Sears and Roebuck, former Sears and Roebuck. They used to do all kinds of things. They provided lumber to build homes. There are a couple of houses in King Street that were built because the lumber came on the train and they were put together as Rosenwald houses.
Of course, as you know, before slavery, blacks were not allowed to learn to read or write. They were just not allowed to be educated. So after slavery, I think it's when the black families in the South realized how important it would be for their children to be educated. They realized that to be educated would have an advantage. It would allow them to be elevated above the level at which they were forced to grow up, not having the skills and the necessary education to be able to be self-sustaining. You'd be surprised to know that it was a very sophisticated operation. There were architects that were hired to design these schools. These schools had to be positioned a certain way in order to get the maximum amount of sunlight during the day. Yes, it was, and a lot of those plans are still, well, in fact, I guess all of them are still available. So they adjusted the plans to meet the needs of the community in which they were planning to serve. For example, in Williamsburg County, the Neesmith Corner School, and that it was a small area geographically, not an extensive population. So that school was built with that in mind, with I guess 2 classrooms and maybe 2 or 3 teachers. So some of the larger schools, based on the population of the area, were built accordingly.
The location, Williamsburg County is a very large county, and the location, children had to walk to schools, and they needed to be located conveniently so they could walk to school or get there on time. They didn't have school buses as they have. Some of your Rosenwald schools were 2 classes, some of them were 3 classes, some of them were 4 classes, some of them were 6 classes, and some of them were 8 classes. The school buildings were built so that you had an area where a shop could be taught, you could have different classes, you could also have walls that could be removed, and the community actually met in those schools for meetings. At the St. Mark's School, there's a man that's still living that used to provide movies. They had movies on Saturday. They would open the walls back and they would have like a theater and they could show the movies.
Here was a Jewish gentleman, white, who was collaborating with an African-American educator, Booker T. Washington, to put forth these efforts to educate these schools. Now, Rosenwald would contribute up to at least 25% of the funds for these schools. And in some information Ms. McGill and I saw, there's a listing also of the funds for these schools that were donated by the African American communities and the funds that were donated for some of these schools from the white community as well. So with these three combination of funds, those were the funds that were used to build these schools and I guess to help sustain these schools.
The Rosenwald schools were built with grants. The Rosenwald Foundation gave grants and the community had to raise matching monies. It's unbelievable because they didn't have jobs as we have them today, but those people were able to sell pies and cakes and do things and raise money. And they had a short period of time to raise this money. Some of them raised up to $800 in like 2 or 3 months. And this money was used to match the grants. And then the public gave so much into those schools.
Now in South Carolina, there were 481 Rosenwald schools and Williamsburg County had 10 schools. Will the 10 Rosenwald schools please come forward? Thanks to funds allocated from the General Assembly through Senator McGill, through the Tourism Board, signs have been purchased with funds from the Tourism Board. Thank you. Signs have been purchased. Thank you. To be placed at all of the sites.
The 10 schools in Williamsburg County, the names changed from what they originally were. We had locations, a couple of them burned and they were replaced. The schools, one I know in particular, Tomlinson, continued until the 70s.
These 10 schools, if you go out to the Cooper site out at Bethesda, if you go and you look close, all of these historic buildings that were here before are in dire need, such as that facility. That schoolhouse is in dire need of repair. It may cost $250,000 to repair it, but we should be mandated to reach out and figure out how to make it work. And Supervisor Paisley, there's no question that we'll have to work some type of a lease agreement with the county in order to make that happen. And we can get together with the Thomasonian Committee. I also tell you at this very site, the city of Kingstree, some years ago, on the request of Dr. Barnes of the Thomasonian Committee, we named this area the Tomlinson Day, Association Day, and that's in the history books. Miss Isabel Bard, she participated and others in making that happen, and it made a big difference, significant difference. And let me tell you why. When the gym was here, the last standing, and there were a lot of intramural basketball games going on, and even a boxing club was in this facility, and many other educational opportunities and mentoring with children and working with senior adults. It made a big difference. But when it caught on fire, Ms. Holt, when it caught on fire, similar to what occurred to you and your husband, your family, and it was a big loss for Kingstree, as Holt's Jewelry Store is a big loss, and we look forward to y'all getting a new door open and look forward to that day. But when this building burned, I can tell you, Pro Tem, that monies from this building, from the insurance fund, were given to the Williamsburg County Recreation Department towards building the Williamsburg County Recreation Center. So the Tomlinson site contributed money towards building that recreational facility, gave the seed money. The school was able to keep a little bit of the money, but graciously the school board, Dr. Barnes, gave the funds from the insurance policy on this fire that occurred. And I say these things to you because the history should be documented. If we had Dr. C.E. Murray here today, what could he tell us about all 10 schools?
I am a 1966 graduate of Tomlinson, and I know my brother Wendell is a 1970 graduate of Tomlinson, and that was the last class that was graduated from Tomlinson. I had no idea then, though it was a Rosenwald school, I'm finding out way after the fact. But I think, and I remember my mother attended Tomlinson also, so Tomlinson had been around for a long time. As we said, the Rosenwald schools are all built between 1920s and 1930s in Williamsburg County, but Tomlinson, I know, was of course a segregated school, and I personally felt that I really got an excellent education with the limited resources that we had at that time. The school at that time offered, I know, a home economics department. They offered a business curriculum. They offered shop, auto mechanic, and masonry. Yes, all of those were offered. So our students were able to graduate from schools with these skills. And I was talking to somebody from Charleston the other day, and she was saying her school even had beauty culture. But of course, we did not have beauty culture here in Kingstree at that time. And I think a lot of Tomlinson graduates and a lot of Williamsburg County graduates have really gone on to be really successful with the limited resources we had. And two, we had teachers that we felt deep in our hearts really cared for us and about us. And they would share all of the positive things that they were aware of to make sure that we were going to be more successful than they were. I mean, that's always been kind of the outlook in our community. I want my child to do better than I did, and I want my grandchild to do better than their parents. So I think we tried to put things into place to ensure that that happens.
It just goes to show the efforts of some makes a big difference as it relates to the education of many. When I look at what occurred years ago, we can talk specifically about schools, about the contributions of those who made it all possible, but we can look beyond what they did and ask ourselves the question as it relates to this generation, what is now our obligation? And that's one of the beauties of becoming aware of historical events. It sort of enlightens you in terms of where you are, and it ought to serve as a challenge in terms of where we ought to go. I listened to a rare interview this morning with the CEO of Amazon, who finds himself in billionaire status. And I looked in terms of the investments that he's making, and I said to myself, the kinds of investment that a billionaire can make can have a worldwide impact. But when you look at him as an individual, he was but a person like you and I. And I say that simply to say you never know where life can take you. But to the extent that you get educational opportunities young, as some of those persons who took advantage of the Rosenwald opportunities that were afforded to them, I challenge all of us, young and old, to continue to look for that which we are able to put our hands on and ask ourselves the question, how can we then use it to better our community and indeed, in some instances, better the world. Two more comments and then I'll actually take my seat. One of the other things that I picked up on as it related to the Rosenwald schools that I think serves as a basis for us to improve is the fact that these schools not only served as a house for education, they served as a hub for the community. And those teachers that taught at the schools had great impact beyond the school walls. One of the challenges that they found themselves making was not only to educate the students as they got there, but to make certain that the students got home safely, and to make certain that they had community meetings in order that they might get an appreciation for what was going on in the community and then ask themselves what is their role in making the community a better place. And I think that we as a community have come just a wee bit selfish, and we don't look to the needs of others. What they did in those days was, y'all know, funds had to be made, had to be raised, wood had to be cut, food had to be served, and there were families who had more than other families, but all of them came together, raised funds, sacrificed to make sure that not only their child, but all of the children had opportunities.
And we fail, y'all. We fail as a community if we only look to our own house and our own children. And so I think what we ought to grow from this experience is that community challenge, that sense of challenge. And let me speak racially for a moment, because there's another lesson in this where the races come together and they better the lives of the needy regardless to their race. And that is a lesson that we ought to glean from what we learn here today.
The Rosenwald schools, and they were after it, you had black schools and you had white schools. In 1954, the decision was made that you should no longer continue with that effort, and schools were desegregated. In other words, the schools were made where you could go to white schools, or what had been formerly white schools, or black schools. You could go to any of them, and as a result, we had the desegregation process. We didn't do that quite as well as we should have done it, because we started tearing down all of the black schools and getting rid of the history of what was happening in black schools. And we simply decided that going to the other schools must have been better, so we didn't bother to tell them to come to our schools.
You know, back, like she said, in 1954 was when they did a separate but equal, and these equalization schools were built. So by this time, most of the Rosenwald schools, if any were still standing, were probably either not being, they might have been being utilized a few, or they were certainly maybe still standing and about to be torn down or torn down.
Some years ago, I was invited to serve on a tourism board for the county. And at that time, we had festivals and lots of other activities, but the activities were not always as inclusive of all of our citizens as I thought they should have been. So we started looking for activities that could bring in tourists to look at some things that would be a little more inclusive. And as a result of that, we decided that if we could actually locate and get some information about our Rosenwald schools, that this would be something that could be a little more inclusive with tourism.
Well, like I said, we wanted to, once we realized just that that whole history existed, we felt as though it was very important and it was imperative that we share that with the community. It is important that we share that information with the students, with the schools, so that they too can know that significance and history relative to their educational basis. They need to realize that where we are today is a result of Rosenwald schools and the other schools, the early schools right after slavery was abolished, that all of that helped to build them to get where we are today. It's just an important process.
Well, we got signs for all of the schools, and we're in the process of trying to locate, or at least as closely as we can, locate where these schools belong. And these signs will be erected at the site. We're still processing this. This has been a task, but we are closer to finding all 10 of them than we've ever been before.
I think what that whole process showed was that blacks and whites can come together for a common cause to try to help the minority population as well. And as I said before too, to try to encourage, the parents to encourage their children and provide those skills and activities and things that are needed for them to do that. Thompson was a Rosenwald school. I attended Tomlinson. I appreciate, the education I got there. I appreciate the support of the teachers, the staff, and the principal, that I got there. And even to this day, I even enjoy interacting with my classmates. So I just think it's a whole culture that has evolved as a result of, our benefiting from the Rosenwald schools. I would like for them to remember about the Rosenwald school system, that it too is a very significant part of our educational history, not only here in Williamsburg County, but in the 15 southern states in which they provided schools and education to the population.
I really hope that the Rosenwald school systems will be remembered as an institution that actually provided education and a step forward for so many black children.